Okay, great. Well, thank you everyone for joining, giving up your Friday afternoon or part of it anyway. And thank you, Dan, too, for doing that, especially on SpaceX Day.
Yeah.
I kind of only realized this a few days ago. I was like, okay. So I've tried to blend the SpaceX with this and say, why not get a nice run into when it floats at 3 o'clock by coming to this. But yeah, and just a bit of housekeeping. So nothing here is investment advice. It's all for educational purposes. It is being recorded, but nobody other than Dan or myself will be on the recording. Okay, so let's jump in. Money Men, fabulous.
Look, love to see it.
Yeah, it's there's just so much in it. I mean, there's so much that happens, and at every step, every phase, almost more things start happening. And I don't know how you existed in that space for that long. Or how you even managed to put it all together into one book, but it's an incredible story. It goes way beyond a typical corporate fraud, right? It's like it goes way beyond the typical cooking the books a little bit. It's between the spies and the characters, and that was kind of the first thing I wanted to draw out. So it's the Wirecard story, but then at the start of the book you have this cast of characters and several pages long.
Quite a few confusing German names in there sometimes.
Yeah, and it's very necessary. And I like how you've done it. Like some of them are bandits, the short sellers and the analysts, some of whom I know, and then the Financial Times. And I love your little brief descriptions of them. So I've been trying to think about even how to jump off. But I mean, if we go into the timeline a little and just use that as the kind of spine of how we talk about it, because as I said, it's kind of more and more just keeps happening. So at first, this company kind of existed. You weren't aware of it. And then someone brings it to you, a short seller. Is that right?
It was John Hempton in Australia.
Yeah. I know John, actually. Yeah. So I'm not surprised. And I'm not so. I think in the documentary, you say, how do you feel about some gangsters?
Yeah.
Gangsters or something. So that's very John. But and so does that happen often to you when someone comes, or how does that work?
Well, I mean, John and I knew each other for a few years at this point because we've been sparring over Herbalife.
Herbalife is a big one, yeah.
And so that was one of the big stories which got me interested in short sellers in the first place.
Right.
And so it was this big battle between Bill Ackman and Carl Icahn. But John Hempton was sort of blogging away.
Yeah.
Talking about how actually he thought Herbalife was a great business and this was a terrible short.
Yeah.
And so I thought Herbalife was a pyramid scheme and wrote lots about how it had very pyramid scheme-like qualities. And so we had sort of got to know each other on that. And he knew the kind of thing I was interested in. When he said to me, would I be interested in some German gangsters? It wasn't completely out of the blue. The phrase we use is stories get stories. And so because I've written about a bunch of accounting frauds and dodgy companies, people came to me with more stories, and that still happens these days as well. Although there is back then there weren't that many people writing about activist shorts and these sorts of situations, and there weren't that many activist shorts, and now they sort of proliferate all the time.
Yeah, and it's kind of an interesting one. So I used to follow John's blog. It's the Bronte Capital. And it was like really great, like detailed breakdowns of shorts he found and situations he found and people he found and how he went about it and what he noticed. So as a person of finance, I just found it riveting. But short sellers are generally kind of on the edge of the community in general, right? And that's part of it. It's part of the gig. So it's interesting that you see more of them coming out of the woodwork, proliferating, as you say. Do you think that's changed a little, or what are your thoughts on that? And there's a question on that later, it's probably a bit more pointed, but
yeah, I mean, there's always been short sellers because you need sellers to make a market, right? And there's some, if you read More Money Than God, which is that brilliant history of the hedge fund industry, You know, there's been high-class short sellers around for decades. And I think one of the differences is their sort of willingness to go, or some of them, their willingness to go public. So a lot of the time, there's a lot of short sellers who prefer to find interesting stuff and then have a quiet word with a journalist like me. And then it turned out you can make quite a lot of money by making the noise yourself. And sort of things happen a bit faster. The problem or the frustration I think that some investors find when they talk to journalists is they hand them a bunch of interesting stuff and then nothing happens for ages. And sometimes when the story comes out, it's, you know, it's not everything they hoped because we have to go through our legal processes. And there's a big difference between sometimes what you know or strongly suspect and what you can get into print. You know, a big current through the book is our attempt to get the F word in print. Fraud, obviously. And I think that also you have some great examples. So Hindenburg had an amazing run and did terrific work. And so now that team is disbanded, you've got a bunch of sort of other Hindenburg people out there, and he sort of has inspired, you know, a bunch of other people to have a go. And I meant as well to thank you as well, because at the time I just joined HSBC. I was part of a division in private banking and wealth, running a global equity kind of portfolio and list. Wirecard was on there when I joined. Everyone loved it. The sell side analysts, which you touch on in your book, all supportive. The great story, you know, European tech. And then, you know, your piece came out, and your first kind of piece. And I thought, you know, I wasn't really following it closely, but I was on the stock committee. And when the second piece came out, I was like, okay, you know, and there was a big fight. There's always, you know, obviously there's always a fight from the other side, but I thought, you know, the FT, you know, it's one thing if it's one of these smaller things, but my understanding, I did realize that there's always a gap between what you want to say and what you can say. And so I pushed pretty hard and got it off the list. And thankfully, a few months later, that paid off. So I thank you for that. Oh, you're welcome.
Yeah, there weren't many who did that, I think. And a lot of people weren't too happy with me either, but it worked out. But yeah, so back to the timeline. So John Hempton says that you're in New York at the time. Is that right?
No, I just come back from New York.
You just come back. Okay.
And we threw this sort of fun financial festival in the city of London on a cricket pitch. And he came along to that. And so he comes to you with that, and then what makes you, like you say, you get a few of these, you know, are relatively frequent. What makes you kind of poke at one more than another? Or well, so there are a couple of interesting names, and to be honest, when John mentioned it to me, I sort of picked up the annual report and had a look, and it made no sense. It was all this gobbledygook about something to do with payments. What really, and it's always that interesting thing between who's first gets a lot of the credit, but really I need to give a lot of credit to Leo Perry at Ennismore as well, because he got in touch separately and was like, and said, hey, I want to chat about this company Wirecard. Obviously because John had mentioned it as well, and so that little light bulb goes off. Like, whoa, yeah, Wirecard.
That's too,
I'm interested in those. And I go along and meet Leo at this coffee shop, and he has these sort of, they almost look like they've been produced on a typewriter, these sort of densely written notes on a whole bunch of stuff he's found combing through the Wirecard accounts. And he sort of just basically lays out this theory that it's an accounting fraud, and that they've been buying a bunch of businesses across Asia and using them to cook the books. And what was interesting was kind of those two encounters sort of set up the big question mark which hung over Wirecard for years and years, and I think which helped it get away with it for so long, because there were these two theories of wrongness. One was it was accounting fraud, but the other were these gangsters. And Wirecard had a reputation for racy payments processing. You know, it was sort of the PayPal of Europe, except everyone kind of knew that if you had some dodgy business online to get, you went and spoke to Wirecard about it.
I mean, so I'm just looking at my notes here because I had one within the first, I think it's chapter 2. I've lost it on me. Oh yeah, I think actually it's in the prologue. You talk about this sales guy who'd moved from Sony in Brussels, and he ends up on a Formica table talking to the owner of a website for arseholes and armpits.
Yeah.
So to set the kind of tone of what you're talking about, that kind of describes it. Is that right?
Yeah, because I mean, so the thing that's going on with the book as well is you sort of, it's got this like cat and mouse quality. So the perspective shifts back and forwards between chapters. So there's sort of the historical, what was going on inside Wirecard, and then it's sort of, then we jump to my perspective while I'm trying to work out what on earth, sort of from the outside looking in, what on earth is going on, and those two storylines sort of converge as, you know, the battle takes place. But yeah, it was this weird kind of wild company where they just went after all the business which other people didn't want to do, which is legitimate, and there was a lot of money there, at least initially.
And you know, you mentioned earlier, it's, you know, this kind of fraudulent situation, but that is, you know, relatively common in the world of business, but it's that gangster element as well. But just to set the timelines, well, this is about what, 2009, 2010?
So the first time I speak to John Hempton, 2014.
2014. Okay, yeah, and then it was all 2020. So there's 6 years, of this, and there's kind of, you know, correct me if I'm wrong, but I see 3 phases in this. First phase is kind of the initial checking it out. I think you go to Dubai, is it, to look for Al Alam. There's nothing there. Nobody knows what this is. And then it kind of escalates slightly. I mean, there's a bit in the middle, I think, where kind of not much is happening because you don't have enough to go with, I think is what you're saying. But then some other stuff comes in, but then it gets a bit more dark and a bit more sinister. Is that right?
Yeah, so let me lay it out. So I get this tip about this funny little European company. And and I sort of try and write stuff about it, but it's, you know, it's sort of one for the connoisseurs. It's a bit geeky. It's a bit wonky in terms of accounting. And the big problem is I can't use the F word because we can't prove it. This is all just speculation. And it's kind of like, should the numbers really work like this? It's unusually profitable. And things about it don't seem to make sense. And whilst I got interested about it, it was all the stuff behind the scenes that convinced us something deeply weird was going on, because you had, you know, people were being menaced. There were private detectives running around. We realized that hackers were trying to break into our emails and the emails of people who had also said nasty things about the company. And while all that is happening, you're kind of like, oh, there's just something up about this guy. Well, actually, yeah, because I got to do one interview with the chief executive quite early on, Marcus Brown.
On the phone, was it?
Yeah, it was on the phone. And, you know, he's a former management consultant. It was all very blue sky, big picture. But one of the fun things is you, as a journalist, you get to ask people really rude questions. So sort of let them warm up, talk for a while. And then it's like, okay, what's going on with these transactions? All these businesses you're buying in Asia. You know, it seems like you're cooking the books here. And what always stuck with me was he answered in the way liars do. Yeah. So he answered with a question, why would I do these things? But also it was his tone. So he did say, yes, this is bullshit. But it was much more like, oh, people are always asking me if I'm a criminal. Let me just explain why I'm not at all. Yeah, and that was one of the things that always stuck with me, is like,
I wasn't shocked at the question.
I don't believe a word this guy is saying.
Yeah.
But the big turning point. So there's 2 big turning points. So one is Wirecard starts heading towards the DAX index. So this is sort of 2017. You know, a whole bunch of stuff happens. It all goes a bit mad. We almost get sued, and I sort of give up because I've tried to write all these stories and no one really cares. And then Wirecard share price triples. And suddenly it's knocking on the door of joining Germany's DAX index.
Mm.
You know, it's worth 20-something billion by now.
Yeah.
And as that process is happening, my boss, Paul Murphy, gets offered an enormous bribe.
Well, yeah, sorry, I remember this.
So he's out for lunch with one of his contacts who sort of mentions money might be available. Go talk to this other guy, you know. So he goes and talks to this nightclub owner who says, yeah, if you can just make all these Wirecard stories go away, could be $10 million in it for you. So he sort of came back and told us this. And I will admit, my first reaction and some of my colleagues were like, that's a lot of money.
Yeah. Yeah.
But we assume it's a trap. And so we end up having this lunch where he goes with, you know, he's wired for sound. Some of my colleagues are sort of nearby at another table, sort of with a camera and a handbag.
Is this normal for you guys? Like, is this normal?
This is so far out of the ordinary.
Yeah.
I mean,
I
mean, like the FT haven't done anything like this. Actually, no, the reason we had the spy kit, because we had just done the President's Club sting, I think earlier that year, for which we'd had to get a whole load of spy kits. So we were just starting to experiment with this kind of stuff.
Yeah. It was really to justify a budget, is what you're saying.
Well, no, I mean, you get to go and buy some toys, but yeah, we were, you know, I think we all agree we were probably a bit amateurish in this, whereas Wirecard was paying some quite expensive private security firms who were sort of doing counter surveillance on us and clocked the whole thing offshore. And so, you know, it transpires this guy, Jan Marsalek, who is the man behind the curtain pulling all the strings, is very charming, but, you know, doesn't offer us lots of money at the table. He has his intermediaries do that in a way that we can't prove it or write it. So we're kind of left with nothing. Like, we've got these deep suspicions that there is something fundamentally wrong with this company. They're crooks. And then, sort of out of like this clear blue sky, a whistleblower appears. And that is like the turning point in the whole thing. And what's amazing to me, I still love this fact, is it wasn't actually the whistleblower who got in touch. It was his mum.
Yeah, I remember this. Yeah. Yeah.
And it was, and so her son was a lawyer in Wirecard's business. And, you know, he had launched this internal investigation into crimes going on.
Yeah.
But instead of the people involved being suspended, he was the one who was kicked out. And so
and she was disgruntled at the situation.
She was disgruntled. Like, she's this amazing woman who had, you know, single mum, had kicked out her alcoholic husband, raised him herself. She had sort of forged a career in finance whilst you know, looking after him, and she knew how things are supposed to work, and she was not going to let them get away with doing this to her son. Well,
she did. Yeah, she's right.
And so she gets in touch with me, and
she's in Singapore, right? They're in Singapore, aren't they?
Yeah, and they're in Singapore. And I mean, I think he was quite startled when she told him, "What on earth have you done?"
Yeah.
But so I flew out to Singapore, and it turned out he didn't just know what was going on, but before he'd left, he'd taken a copy of everything.
Yeah, I remember from the documentary, it was like 70 gigabytes. Is that right?
Oh, yes, something like that, easily.
Yeah, yeah. And so that's, I mean, there's a lot there. And I think you were talking about how, you know, there was this surveillance happening and you know, counter surveillance to you guys. I'm not sure I call yours surveillance by the sounds of it, but so the things that kind of stood out to me from the book, there was one where they were listening to the FT offices across the Thames. Is that right?
Yeah, they so we encountered all sorts of counter surveillance and dirty tricks, one of which was we published this big story about Wirecard in, I think, January 2019, and it finally has the F word, fraud, right there in the headline. And so the next day, one of my colleagues had sort of been to the gym and was coming back, and he noticed this couple behaving strangely on the opposite side of the river. And Sam Jones was, one of his areas of expertise was the intelligence agencies and that sort of thing. And so he clocked that they had this tripod with what looked like some sort of laser pointer aimed at the FT's conference room across the river. And it just sat there. It's a lovely view. It sat just above the River Thames, and it was where we had the big meeting at, a couple of times a day, where you talk about what's in the next day's paper. And so it was these sort of amateur spies seemed to be trying to listen in on what we were doing.
Yeah. And then there's another bit, which is obviously far more darker, where I think one of your, short seller contacts is a Matthew Earl, gets in his car after dropping his kids off. So that was sort of in the middle bit early on. And so Matthew Earl had helped publish this sort of report on Wirecard anonymously because they were concerned about, reprisals. And Wirecard had worked out who he and at least one of his fellow authors were. And so they started having them tailed by security guards, some of them from Kroll. And so, but he has this, he slowly starts to realize that he's being followed, and he has, I think he just, he was rushing to a meeting, and he suddenly realized he'd forgotten his wallet. And so he turns around to go back and then realizes that this car is following him, this sort of black, I think, Mercedes sports car, which he'd also noticed as he passed. And so then he kind of realizes that he's being followed. And kind of interesting that what on earth do you do in that moment? Yeah. Because, his heart's going 100 times a minute. And I think he gets to the station and this sort of car follows him and then realizes, he realizes he's been blown. And so he jumps on a train and escapes. But when you're sort of one guy, a short seller who's doing this thing quietly, I mean, that's quite terrifying when you don't know who you're dealing with. Yeah. And then on that, so that there's a segue there to the Marsalek, right? So, later on, we start to realize through your book and the story that he's seemingly connected to a few Secret Service agencies, and the Russian, he's across his private secret office is across from the Russian embassy, and various other things. So there is that other layer to it. But when was the first point you kind of realized, oh, this is a bit different? I mean, I know there's the gangster element, but when you really realized, oh, hang on a second, it's not Braun so much as is this other person. Well, so I think in the first couple of years, we started to become aware that this guy Marsalek was important in all the sort of pushback behind the scenes, because he was the one who was. There's this moment where his company's been attacked by short sellers, so he tries to leak this bid rumor to pump up the share price. And I think that was when we first sort of became aware of him, because we knew it was him. Because he briefed one of our journalists that that this bid was happening and gave us all the details. And you're like, we were kind of, there are many moments in the story where we're scratching our heads, going, "What on earth is happening?" And we slowly come to realize that he's the guy. So he's the guy who Paul meets. And after all of that is over, he's sitting there drinking gin and tonics with this nightclub owner and his son, and he starts bragging about how he has all these private interests in Libya, and starts telling stories about Wagner mercenaries blowing up insurgents and that kind of thing. And I think that was the first time, and obviously this gets back to us, and you're kind of in the
sorry, what on earth are you talking about? This this German finance executive has a sideline in Libyan mercenary operations,
shadow warfare.
And then this whole thing happens, where just before the whistleblower appears, it transpires he'd sort of been bragging about his intelligence contacts,
right,
and sort of waving around these documents to do with the Skripal poisoning when the Russian defector was poisoned in the UK,
in Salisbury.
And so we start to realize that he's claimed, and various people think he was connected to at least 2 intelligence agencies. He also had a friend who was very well connected to an ex-CIA agent, and he seemed to be swapping messages with a former US ambassador. And so and so what this slowly turns into, so I can't remember the exact moment, but I do remember there was a moment early on, after we published our first sort of big story in 2019, where sort of Paul Murphy pulls me into a room and tells me that actually we think Marsalek might be connected to Russian intelligence. And everything is already going a bit mad. Like at this point, the German government has already waded in and seems to be investigating me and one of my colleagues, Stefania,
well, that's something I want to touch on.
Market manipulation. And so that's a whole bit of completely different madness where you think, wait, hang on a second, is Wirecard,
where are you going with it?
And then Murphy is sort of trying to tell me that Jan Marsalek has connections to Russian spies. And I mean, I don't think I really believed it to begin with, because it just sounded so insane. And then once you do start to believe it, it becomes quite intimidating, because the Russians have not the best reputation, shall we say. And it gets madder and madder, and it turns into this big public fight. And we're trying to publish what we think is, the killer blow. We can prove that they're fraudsters. And as we're doing that, we realize there's this huge team of private detectives running around London on behalf of Wirecard. And the guy orchestrating it is a former head of Libyan intelligence, one of Marsalek's mates. And yeah, all of that was, I mean,